So let's open again with a word of prayer this morning. Dear Lord, thank you again for letting us all be here in your house to hear your word. Please continue again to help us grow in our underpinning our strength of the historicity of the Bible to help us bear the arrows of the evil one as he fires them at us. Amen. So we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked earlier about this cool topic called epistemology, and we talked about analytic statements versus synthetic statements versus technically meaningless statements. And I'm sure we all remember what those are, but for the one of you that might not, the analytic statements are statements that are inherently true. They're definitional. 1 + 1 = 2. They are always correct because they are based on definitions or axioms, and so they don't actually require any testing to verify that they are true, right? Synthetic statements, we remember synthetic statements are things that require evidence to determine whether it is true or not. The example I used was the number of chairs in this room, which you think anybody could count and get the same answer, but there could be chairs hiding somewhere. And so you have to test it, and there's never 100% certainty that you're going to get the right answer from any synthetic statement, 100% proof. You never get to 100% proof on anything, not in any scientific discipline, nothing. You get to an appreciable amount of proof, overwhelming proof, beyond a shadow of a doubt proof, but you never get to 100% certainty. And so that's what we do in apologetics, is we don't try to get to 100% certainty because it's really not possible, and it's not necessary. It's not a standard that any other synthetic statement is held to, no matter what kind of scientific or historical or whatever statement. Nobody holds a synthetic statement to 100% proof. And the whole claim that Christianity, because it is so impactful, requires 100% certainty doesn't make any sense if you think about it long enough. We talked about we make decisions that are life and death every day about things like crossing the street or driving in Amarillo, and we make those recognizing we had a really good chance of surviving it, but we do it anyway. And why do we do it? Because we've assessed it, and with our epistemology or our understanding of what we believe is true, how much evidence we need to look into, how much evidence we need to look at to convince ourselves that something is true enough for us to risk our life on it. That's where we get to. And yet all of us cross the street, drive, eat at restaurants, although I don't eat breakfast burritos anymore, but most of us eat at restaurants still. So we don't want to think that we have to hold Christianity to this 100% certainty because nothing else is. Last week we talked about the test that you would apply to any historical document to determine whether it was handed down to us as it originally existed, at least for the most part. And we looked at 3 tests. We actually looked at 2 out of 3 tests. We looked at the internal test, and we looked at the bibliographical test. So the bibliographical test was how faithfully do we believe the documents were actually handed down to us. And what we discovered is, unlike a lot of other ancient historical documents, we see that the gospel texts were written very close to the time of the events that they report, and the number of manuscripts we have, like 25,000, is far beyond any other work of ancient literature. And so we are in really good shape from a historicity of the Bible, from a bibliographical test. We looked at the internal test. What does the Bible say about itself? And it's really important when we're reading the Bible to understand that it says several things about itself, and depending on what section you're talking about, you have to read it in that context. For instance, there are sections that are very much written like history books. There are sections that are written like poetry, like songs. There are even some hyperbolic statements in the text. And you have to read those as they're written. So when you have somebody say, well, you take the Bible too literally, no, we take the Bible as it was intended to be taken, depending on what part of the Bible we're reading. There are some parts that you need to take literally. There are some parts you need to recognize are poetry. There are some parts you need to recognize are songs. There are some that are like Revelation. It's very challenging to read because it's a vision that's probably intentionally written so that it's a little bit challenging to understand, and that's fine. Yes, Pat?
You said that we need to recognize, like the poetry as a poem and song, but isn't there still the truth of the Lord behind it?
Yes, so it's not that it's wrong, right? So when we say that when we're reading the songs, we're reading songs that God would say yes to, because they're, nothing in the Bible was not given to men by the Holy Spirit. It says they were carried along by the Holy Spirit as they wrote this. But there's no reason the Holy Spirit can't write poetry or songs, as opposed to history, okay? Good question. Where we stopped was really on the internal test. What does the Bible say about itself? And we see that what it says is that Jesus came into this world as God's way of reconciling mankind unto himself. He died, was resurrected, was seen by many, and ascended, and he explained what that meant to us. We are to believe in him, and then we too will have everlasting life in our bodies, resurrected, in the new earth, which will be wonderful. I can't wait, personally. And we will be without sin, and I've made the statement before that I can't imagine what it's like to be without sin. I mean, you kick the sin out of me, you got nothing left but a pair of shoes, right? So it is fascinating to think that. It's definitely something to look forward to, right? That we don't look forward to being spirit beings in heaven playing harps with wings. We look forward to being back in our bodies in the new earth, and I plan on growing peppers and making salsa, and will not have problems with acid reflux no matter how spicy the salsa is. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to start with what's called the external test. So if you get a piece of literature that was written a long time ago, and we've determined that it looks like it was faithfully preserved, and it looks like it says that it is based on eyewitness testimony of events that were happening that it purports to report. But the thing that would really help with that is if we had other reports that were outside of the four Gospels that said basically the same thing, that they at least confirmed some of the facts or some of the historical facts that are recorded in the Gospels. So if you don't find any evidence of Jesus being on the earth except for the four Gospels, then you're in a weaker position. But fortunately, we don't have a problem with that. So we will cover some of the what we call the external tests. So what did contemporaries, as in the people that were living near to the time that these books were circulating early, talking first couple centuries ideally, what were those people saying about Jesus, about Christians, or the way at the time? And we do find some excellent texts. So are there corroborating sources that are independent of the New Testament text? Turns out there's a few. So we have information from a person named Papias. He lived from 60 to 130 AD, so pretty close to the time of the events of recorded in the Bible. And he was actually Papias, on the basis of what he heard from John, informs us that Mark recorded what the Apostle Peter told him, and that he had paid attention to this one thing, not to omit anything that he had heard, nor to include any false statement among them. So there's something called the preface from Papias, and I think I'm going to do that also. So this is Papias writing, and it was recorded by Eusebius. And I think the point of this is to say that we have the John, the apostle that Jesus loved. He had students who taught students who taught students, and that lineage is traceable. So you can see that the teachings go all the way back to John. So Papias writes, I shall not hesitate also to put into ordered form for you, along with the interpretations, everything I learned carefully in the past from the elders, and noted down carefully for the truth of which I vouch. For unlike most people, I took no pleasure in those who told many different stories, but only in those who taught the truth. Nor did I take pleasure in those who reported their memory of someone else's commandments, but only in those who reported their memory of the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. And if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders arrived, I made inquiries about the words of the elders, what Andrew or Peter had said, Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the Lord's disciples, and whatever Ariston and John the elder, the Lord's disciples, were saying, for I did not think that information from the books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving source. So what's great about this is we have people who were early Christians who had a connection directly to the apostles in their ministry after the resurrection and ascension of Christ. So you don't have to wait. In fact, what Papias is saying is he was actually interviewing the people and not just reading what other people had written or things that were circulating, similar to Luke. Irenaeus, an early Christian from around 130 to 202, he was a student of Polycarp in Smyrna, who in turn had been a disciple of John himself and had heard from him and from the others personally acquainted with Jesus' eyewitness accounts. And he states, Matthew published his gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue. When Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. After their departure, i.e. the death during the Neronian persecution, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. So why do I say this? I think the important thing is, again, we have a continuous line from the apostles that had been eyewitnesses to the events recorded in the Gospels to their students and their students' in the early church. So it wasn't like the death and resurrection and ascension of Christ is something that happened and then was like lost to antiquity and found again. It was a continuous transmission of the historical accounts from eyewitness testimony. So,
another thing that I find interesting is, when I think about that period of history, books were like rare as hen's teeth, and the ability to read was even rarer. And yet all these guys were, putting out like monthly periodicals, and people were reading them and they were being distributed. And I find that fascinating because of how we treat the written text today. I mean, we read it and toss it. Not your stuff, mind you. We'll hold on to that. But the written text, you read it once and toss it. But this stuff, gosh, it was making the rounds, and people were reading it and digesting it and all that other stuff, which kind of paints a different picture of people, just telling everything through oral history that got changed from one voice to the next.
Yeah, and I don't think I really knew that growing up. I guess my vision was the letters of Paul and the gospel accounts had been written, and that as they were passed around from church to church, that's where the churches learned all of their theology. But that's not entirely correct, because you have the continuous teaching person to person from the apostles forward to Polycarp and Papias and Eusebius and Irenaeus, and you can trace them forward. And so it's not just the writings that were circulating. There was also, even more immediate than the writings, was the preaching from the apostles and their students. One of the reasons I mention that, all of this, is there is supposedly a text called the Q. I don't know if anybody has heard about the Q. To me, he was a bad guy on Star Trek. But there's a theory out there that there is one ring to rule them all. There was one document that was called Q. I don't know why. And that all of the Gospels were written based on, sourced from that mystery document, which has never been found. And I heard some people say the other day that if you try to put together the Gospels from what you think is in the Q, you get a real mess. So it doesn't, I guess I would say, when you hear about a Q text that predated everything, don't lose sight of the fact that John was teaching his students, like Polycarp, who were teaching their students, and they said, who wrote which book? There's still a debate about did John really write John, or did who wrote the other Gospels? People choose to debate kind of interesting things that don't really add any value. But when you've got the student of John saying these were written by the people who we say they were written by, that's pretty good evidence that we know who wrote them. So there is no Q that has ever been discovered. So again, if there's no evidence for it, and by definition, if I say that Q exists, that's a synthetic statement, which requires what? Evidence, right? So it's something. Yeah.
If it's a analytical statement, and there is no evidence of that analytical statement, statistic, what is it? Synthetic statement, doesn't it thus become a meaningless
Technically
statement?
meaningless, right.
Technically meaningless?
So
Because that's what Q would be, because there's no evidence that document exists.
if no evidence ever shows up, then yeah, it's technically meaningless. If I said that we think Q exists, but we have concrete proof that it's never going to be found, it was carried back up into space by an alien or something, or an angel or something, then we would be setting it up as a technically meaningless thing, because we'd be retracting any possibility of ever finding it.
Right.
So but again, it's just, I would deal with it the same way I would deal with a technically meaningless statement. Basically, don't waste your time on it. It doesn't
Where
mean
did
anything.
that theory originate of this document?
So I think it gets into debates scholars debate, like the order in which the gospel texts were written. A lot of them agree that Mark was probably first. Not everybody agrees with that. You can see people, and they're way smarter than me, so I'm not going to weigh in on how they analyze that, but it seems a little bit not value added to argue which one was written first or second or that kind of thing. It seems like it doesn't mean that much. And if you see something that appears in two Gospels that appears to be very much the same, does that mean that one copied it from another, or does that mean the two people witnessed exactly the same thing and wrote it down the same way? The old philosophical question, if multiple alarm clocks all chime at the same time, did one cause the other one to chime? No. So, I'm sorry, what?
How did that relate to Q, back to where that came from?
So I think and when they're trying to figure out who is the earliest text, you've got scholars that say Mark was the earliest text. And then you've got scholars that say Mark appears to be drawing from another text and can't get more specific than that. So you end up with some other mysterious text that Mark was drawing from. And again, it's like a theory. It's a theory that fits what they see as Mark taking information from another text that we don't have.
But as was proven last week, many of these documents were contemporary documents. They were, within 10 or 15 years of Christ's death and resurrection. In this queue, it sounds like it comes to pass many years later. It's just a theory because people can't understand the commonalities or the differences found in the Gospels.
Yeah, and actually, if there's a common text, you shouldn't have any differences in the Gospels, right? The differences in the Gospel actually lends credibility to them as eyewitness testimony. And if there was a Q and Mark borrowed from it, then the Q would have had to predate Mark, and Mark was very early. So, but I like the fact that we've got quotes from the student of John saying, we know who wrote this, and certainly if Mark wrote Mark and he wrote it based on something else, why wouldn't Polycarp reference that other document, right? It just, there's no there. So we have external evidence definitively stating who authored each gospel text. That undoes any attempt to assert that the New Testament texts are derived from some mystery Q text. Okay, a bit more on the bibliographical evidence. So why are we going back to bibliographical evidence? Because I messed the outline up. Somehow in the external test, I realized yesterday that why is this here? This is like back to what we were doing last week. So in the final version of this outline, I will move this stuff back to the internal test. But rather than trying to do that and making this even more confusing, I just kept it here for right now. So a bit more on bibliographical evidence. It follows from the preceding analysis and evidence that the New Testament documents, with the exception of John's Gospel, should be dated prior to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, and that John's Gospel had its origin around the year AD 95, not long before John's death at Ephesus. We can tell from the language, grammar, and style that Mark got his empty tomb story. Actually, okay, this is an example of somebody who says that Mark got stuff from somebody else. This is from William Lane Craig. We can tell from the language, grammar, and style that Mark got his empty tomb story, actually his whole passion narrative, from an earlier source. In fact, there's evidence of it. The Gospel of Mark was written before AD 37, which is much too early for the legend to have seriously corrupted it. So, it happened it was recorded way too soon for legend to have crept into this.
Isn't it likely that, from my understanding anyway, that what they're calling the Q text might actually be oral transmission of the gospel before it was put down on paper?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, that just seems like the most logical understanding, that it was oral communication prior to Mark putting it down on paper.
Right. Obviously, the oral tradition preceded them writing it down, right? So that makes sense. So Paul dies in the Neronian persecution in 64 to 65, but that is not mentioned in Acts. And I think we mentioned this a previous time, but it's good to repeat, that Acts has really got a large focus on the ministries and the journeys of Paul, and yet it never mentions his death. Acts was written prior to Paul's death. Gospel of Luke was written before Acts. And the Gospel of Mark was written before Luke, as one of the sources for Luke's Gospel was the Gospel of Mark. Therefore, the time period between Jesus' ministry and the writing of the Gospel text was extraordinarily short. So, by contrast, the time period between the writing of Plato's dialogues and the first complete texts discovered during the Italian Renaissance is 1,300 years. That means the New Testament manuscripts were circulating while eyewitnesses to the documented events were still alive. And if the accounts were erroneous, then hostile witnesses would have been able to refute them, but we don't see that. So, again, if they were saying that Jesus was in Jerusalem at this certain day and he wasn't, then that story wouldn't have continued to circulate because hostile witnesses were there to say it didn't happen. Okay, still back to the external evidence. So this is evidence outside the text that we're analyzing, regardless of what that text is. Again, we're looking at the Bible as a historical document at this point. We haven't gotten to the point where it is the inspired Word of God yet. So independent and even hostile sources exist which document information about Jesus. So why would the apostles maintain the resurrection of Jesus as the central fact in their testimony if it could be disproven by witnesses? Jesus showing himself to 500 plus people, eating with them, talking with them, showing his wounds was foundational to the early church. This observable fact resulted in an explosion of growth in the first years of the church. So one of the instances we have of an external hostile witness is the historian named Josephus. So he was a Jewish historian born to a priestly family in around 37 AD. At the age of 19, he joined the Pharisaic party. He fought in the Jewish War in AD 66, being made commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee. After being captured, he won the favor of a Roman commander, Vespasian, by predicting his rise in rank, and acted as interpreter for Titus, Vespasian's son, during the siege of Jerusalem. If you don't have this in your notes, I was still tweaking the outline after I printed it yesterday, so I may say some stuff that's not in your notes, just forewarning. After the fall of the city, he settled down to a comfortable life in Rome as a prisoner of the emperor. This made him rather unpopular with his fellow Jews. However, Josephus wrote historical accounts of the Jewish war and also produced a history of the Jewish people from Genesis up to his current day. Reading Josephus along the Old Testament books can give better insight into what was happening historically during those time periods. I mentioned last week Josephus is not the strictest of historians. He tends to mention himself, and he is a little bit of a color commentator sometimes, so you've got to read him in the context of it's Josephus. But there are still very valuable things that we get from his writings. One of them is this. So one of the writings in his Antiquities document was a statement that we find fascinating. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as had veneration for the truth. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had spoken of these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. Thus, the tribe of the Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. So keep in mind, he's not Christian, which is kind of amazing that somebody can write this and still hold on to Judaism and not being Christian. Remember, early Judaism was looking forward they were messianic, right? They were looking forward to the coming Christ. So you ask yourself the question, well, were the early Jews saved even though Christ hadn't arrived? Well, yeah, they were saved because they had faith in the coming Messiah. He just hadn't come yet. Now, some scholars, of course, this is pretty bad evidence if you're trying to dispute the New Testament documents when you have a historian hostile to the New Testament who's writing something like this. So what do? You say it was altered. The early Christian church must have altered this and changed Josephus' words in order to add some stuff to it, right? One thing that kind of goes against that is that there is a copy of it in Arabic that contains the same quote with a few little differences. And think of how unlikely it would have been for them to go hunt down the Arabic transcription of the text in order to change it also. So the Arabic text translates to, at this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to him 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning who the prophets had recounted wonders. So it's great. We have Josephus, a noted historian, writing in Jewish antiquities about Jesus. Josephus, by the way, also mentions the execution of John the Baptist and the stoning of James, the brother of the Jesus, the so-called Christ, half-brother. Okay, other sources. Two people, Tacitus and Pliny the Younger. You've got to love a name like Pliny the Younger, unless you happen to be a Christian living in that time period, in which case you did not love the name Pliny the Younger. So in AD 115, Tacitus explicitly states that Nero persecuted the Christians as scapegoats to divert suspicion away from himself for the great fire that had devastated Rome in AD 64. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of his procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as hatred against mankind. So Pliny the Younger, 61 roughly AD, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to any wicked deeds, but never commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it. After which it was their custom to separate and to reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind.
So is this where the tradition of the potluck?
Is this where the tradition of potluck came? No, but it is but it is interesting because the early church, the leaders around that time period, were hearing that Christians were cannibals because they were gathering together and eating the flesh and blood of a person. So that's worthy of investigation, right? So you send people to investigate it, and they sit there and they watch what is basically a Christian worship service with the Lord's Supper, bread and wine, and they kind of scratch their head and say, yeah, nothing to see here. It's food of an ordinary kind. But it is really evidence that how the early Christians were meeting and what they were doing. They were singing hymns and they were eating bread and wine. But they understood what they were doing because the accusation when people overheard it was that they were eating some dude named Jesus. Okay, Thallus, an enemy of Christians. Thallus, an enemy of Christians in Rome, wrote around 52 AD about the darkness which occurred during Jesus' crucifixion as being caused by an eclipse. This isn't possible because a lunar eclipse can't occur during Passover, which always occurs during a full moon. An eclipse can only last around 7.5 minutes, whereas the midday darkness during the crucifixion lasted several hours. So this is Thallus trying to explain the midday darkness. So that's great. Again, external evidence that there was darkness in the middle of the day at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. And this is
from Julius Africanus.
And it's captured in F.F. Bruce's The Historical Jesus. On the whole world, there were pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake. So we have external evidence of the earthquake. And man places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thales, in the third book of his history, calls it, as it appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun. Okay. One other thing that we've got that's cool. The Jewish Talmud and Mishnah contain the writings of rabbis who sought to interpret and explain the Old Testament law. These Jewish rabbinical traditions not only mention Jesus, but they are also the only sources that spell out his name accurately in Aramaic, in his native tongue, Yeshua HaNatzri, Jesus of Nazareth. These references seem to be based on written sources, and some come from the Mishnah and the earliest collections of writings in the Talmud. This is no less than the arrest notice for Jesus, which runs as follows. He shall be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and lured Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf. Anyone who knows where he is, let him declare it to the great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. How cool is it that we've actually got the arrest warrant for Jesus? Now, 4 items in this statement strongly support its authenticity as a notice composed for Jesus' arrest. The future tense is used. Stoning was a regular punishment for blasphemy among the Jews whenever the Roman government was not involved. There is no reference whatever to crucifixion, and that Jesus was performing sorcery, and the extraordinary or miraculous with a negative spin, and that's quite remarkable. This meets what the historians call the criterion of embarrassment. That is, since the information is embarrassing to the writer, it's not likely that the writer would have made it up. So this comes from the essay by Dr. Paul Meyer.
David?
Yes.
On that quote of the Sanhedrin, Paul Meyer notes Sanhedrin 43A. So there's a document involved.
However, keep in mind, the documents we're talking about aren't primary sources because their authors weren't in contact with Jesus. It doesn't make them unreliable. It just means when we're talking about primary sources, as in the Gospels are primary sources for Jesus, for the story of Jesus Christ, then when you have these external pieces of evidence, they're great because they support that what was written in the Bible has witnesses that were not, some of them were very hostile and even persecuting the Christian church. So actually, as horrible as it was, it gives them credibility. Okay, and yet despite all this evidence, some people will still argue that Jesus never existed. That is really a leap of faith to argue against the weight of history and say that Jesus never existed, right? Even Bart Ehrman, who we've mentioned, who's certainly not a friend of Christianity, is irritated by atheists who assert that Jesus never existed. When he was confronted by someone who said, "I do not see evidence in archaeology or history for a historical Jesus," he replies by saying, "Well, I do. I mean, I have a whole book on it. There's a lot of evidence. There's so much evidence that," and he just pauses, "I know in the crowds that you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. The reason for thinking that Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. Early and independent sources indicate certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both." And Ehrman continues, "I'm sorry, again, I respect your disbelief, but I think atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. You are much better off going with the historical evidence, rather than coming up with a theory that Jesus didn't exist. So when you have the theory like Jesus didn't exist, that is really in blind faith territory, because you're choosing to ignore all evidence that disagrees with you. Okay. Yes.
Why did the Jewish hierarchy have to have the Romans execute Jesus instead of doing it themselves? Because they didn't need anybody's authorization to stone the woman who was charged with prostitution. They didn't need any authorization to stone Stephen. So I'm curious as to...
Last week's gospel reading, Jesus asked the elders and the chief priests a question, and how did they answer? They said, when they discussed it among themselves, if we say it was from heaven, he'll ask us, why didn't we believe? And if we say it was from man, then we have the people to worry about. So that's the reason that they had the Romans executed, because Jesus was well loved by the populace of the Jewish community, and if they would have stoned him, that would have put them in bad light. But if the Romans do it, they're not, we didn't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have an excuse.
My understanding was they weren't authorized to. So what you're saying, they were...
To crucify him, they were not.
Yeah.
They could have stoned him, they could have executed
Okay,
him.
that's the difference right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that they didn't think they had the authorization to do it. They could have done it
With
but
rocks. Yeah.
But they wanted to stay on the good side of the population.
Thank you. So there are some facts that are agreed to even by a majority of skeptics, and this comes from Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Jesus, The Case for the Real Jesus. Lee Strobel's books are wonderful. If you've never read them, he goes around and interviews scholars in theology and does it as a hostile witness, challenging them and arguing with them, and then recording how they respond to the attacks. And it's wonderful. And, The Case for Christ is a movie, too. The following is a section of the summary, as a summary of Lee Strobel's The Case for the Real Jesus, Challenge 3. So there's 5 facts that are agreed to even by a majority of skeptics. Fact 1, Jesus was killed by crucifixion. The 4 Gospels and the external skeptical sources, Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, Mara bar Serapion, and Jewish Talmud confirm this fact. Fact 2, Jesus' disciples believe that he rose and appeared to them. This is contained in the 4 Gospels, including texts that are derived from oral tradition that predated their copying into the Gospel documents and the writings of Paul. At a very minimum, we can say the vast majority of historians believe that the early apostolic teachings are enshrined in the sermon summaries in Acts. And they're not at all ambiguous. They declare that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. This is from Dr. Michael Lacona in The Case for the Real Jesus. Fact 3, the conversion of the church persecutor, Paul, or Saul of Tarsus. Technically, Paul was a hostile witness to the resurrection. He didn't believe until he personally encountered the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus. And 6 additional ancient sources report that Paul was willing to suffer continuously and even die for his beliefs. Paul had nothing to gain by making up the story of his road to Damascus conversion event. So we think about how horrible it was that the followers of Jesus were martyred after his resurrection. But if you think about that, that is one of the strongest arguments for them telling the truth. right? Because a lot of people die for something they believe to be true that isn't, but it's a totally different thing to die for something you know to be a fraud. Yes, Pastor, did you have something?
Yeah, the notes that you've got there, Luke, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, Dionysius of Corinth, and Origen, are those individuals, early church fathers, that cited that incident as proof of, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
early church fathers.
Right, okay.
Well, in a sense too, you think about God's hand in all this, and actually Nero's persecution of the Christians was almost a gift. Because now we can point back, if these guys believed that strongly, that they were going to risk life and limb to continue spreading the gospel, you got to wonder, nobody would do that just because they're getting rich off of Sunday offerings or anything. I mean, they gave up everything.
Yeah, exactly. And you'll hear people, they'll kind of bend that, and they'll say, well, a lot of religious fanatics are willing to die for something they believe. But that's totally different than if you have sort of a faith in something and you're willing to die for it, that means your faith was really strong. But if you're eyewitnesses to an event that happened in your presence, and it didn't actually happen, and you're willing to die for that, that's not the same thing. Hopefully that's clear. It's totally different to die for something you all get together as a band of 12 and you agree that we're going to make up this cool story. We're going to get nothing for it except persecuted. And then as they're being tortured and killed, none of them recant the testimony because they can't. They know that it's true. So it's an extremely powerful witness. Fact number 4, the conversion of the skeptic James, a half-brother of Jesus. So Josephus confirms the existence of James and identifies him as Jesus' half-brother. Hegesippus, this is in the 2nd century, reports that James was a pious Jew who strictly abided by Jewish law. Mark and John both attest that none of Jesus' brothers believed him. Jesus didn't entrust the care of Mary to James or the other brothers, but rather to John, which I find fascinating. That in 1 Corinthians 15 it states that Jesus appeared to James. And after this, James not only became a believer, but he later becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then James dies as a martyr. So he started off while Jesus was alive, completely hostile to him. And then when he meets him after he's resurrected, that's one way to convert somebody, right? Okay, fact 5, Jesus' tomb was empty. Now that's not as universally agreed to by the skeptics, but 75% or so do. So 75% of scholars agree on the empty tomb as a historical fact, and that's from Gary Habermas in The Case for the Real Jesus. The fact that Jesus was publicly executed in Jerusalem and then publicly seen 3 days later in that same city strengthens the argument that the tomb was empty. Peter claims to the crowd, God raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of that fact. The Roman or Jewish authorities could have simply walked over and pointed to the tomb if it were not in fact empty. So atheists are hard-pressed to argue away the existence of Jesus, the execution of Jesus, or the empty tomb. So where does that leave them? Trying to find another plausible cause for the empty tomb. Okay, given the empty tomb, and given I don't believe in the resurrection of anybody, because miracles just don't happen, then how do I explain that away? Okay, the story that someone stole the body, not that the story was that someone stole the body, right? This is actually in Matthew 28. Jesus said to them, do not be afraid, to the disciples, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and they will see me there. This is the resurrected Christ. While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priest all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Recognize if a Roman soldier failed in his duty as guard, he would be executed. If he failed in his duty of crucifying somebody, he would be executed. If he failed to stand watch on a hill and fell asleep, he would be executed. So,
And the other thing is, if you fell asleep, how do you know what happened?
Right. So the fact that it's really important that that verse and other stuff talks about the fact that they acknowledge.
thank you. They acknowledge that the tomb was empty. And now the effort becomes, well, okay, now we need to spin and explain away the empty tomb. So, Justin Martyr and Tertullian confirm that what is stated in Matthew 28 about the disciples stealing the body continued to be in the Jewish message throughout the 2nd century. That's from the Historical Jesus, F.F. Bruce. So when you combine these facts and acknowledge that the people who encountered the risen Jesus were all willing to be tortured and die without changing their testimony, the most probable explanation that fits is a resurrected Lord. But it doesn't mean people aren't going to make up other theories. So let's talk about a couple of the other theories, how we explain away the empty tomb. Okay, first one we'll talk about is called the swoon theory. So that Jesus just swooned, he didn't actually die. The swoon theory, espoused by Heinrich Paulus and others during the heyday of liberal naturalistic theories, proposes that Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. The theory is that he was badly injured, but recovered at least long enough to be seen by some of his disciples. A version of this swoon theory was popularized in the book The Passover Plot by Hugh Schoenfeld. It describes an elaborate plan by Jesus to fulfill prophecies, like being born of a virgin. That's a hard task to fill. If you're going to try to fill a prophecy, that's pretty impressive, right? Appeared to die on the cross, but actually was drugged by an unidentified man under the direction of Joseph of Arimathea. Recover as he is rescued from the tomb 3 days later, only to die again quickly. There are various other similar constructions. Note that none of them hold up to any degree of critical analysis. So this is discussed in the F.F. Bruce's book again, The Historical Jesus. Note that the Roman soldiers, we'll start picking away at this. Note that the Roman soldiers who performed crucifixions were experts at the trade, and if a person survived the cross and got away, the soldiers would be executed. They had good motivation to ensure that Jesus was dead before removing him from the cross. Now remember how they ensured that he was dead. So normally you would break the legs, but prophecy said he would not have a broken bone, so they couldn't, that was not the way it was done. So they used a spear and pierced his side. So this is a medical analysis that's been done that shows when it says that blood and water came out when they pierced his side, that makes sense from a medical standpoint. Here. So even before Jesus died, the hypovolemic shock would have caused a sustained rapid heart rate that would have contributed to heart failure, resulting in a collection of fluid in the membrane around the heart, called the pericardial effusion, as well as the lungs, which is called a pleural effusion. So that comes from the case, Dr. Alexander Methrel in the Case for Christ. Okay, and Dr. William Edwards wrote an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in '68 that said, clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on an assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Bottom line is, he was dead. He was verified to be dead with a spear, but he was dead before that. So they were just verifying that he was dead. So what modern medicine can explain why water would come out based on the fluid within the pericardial sac and from the blood in the heart, right? So blood and water came out. And again, the Roman soldiers in charge of that crucifixion were not going to let Jesus down until he was dead. Okay, there's a kind of a more radical theory, the chariot of the gods. So the chariot of the gods theory proposes that Jesus was an alien. with the abilities ascribed to him in the Bible. Proposed by Eric von Daniken in 1968, again with the 1968. It states that all religions came about as a result of visitations by aliens who were considered ghosts by the ancients.
It says gods. You said ghosts. I didn't-
Oh, did I? Gods by the ancients. That makes much more sense to say gods by the ancients. Okay, what kind of statement is that? I mean, it sounds synthetic, right? But what evidence would you have to achieve for that? You would have to find a way to prove or disprove that Jesus was an alien. How would you do that? Is there any evidence that you could gather? I mean, how do you know I'm not an alien in a David suit? Well, it's easy because you know I wouldn't have picked this one.
That's easy.
Okay,
However, since the arrival of Jesus was proposed thousands of years prior to his birth, if he was an alien, he was certainly playing the long game. So this is just me being snarky. We can't argue about what is possible, only what is probable. Again, that's not something that is really worth any effort. That is just a desperate effort to throw what we call fire off some chaff, try to distract. Okay, where are we at on time? Okay, good. We got farther than I thought we would today. We're going to start on a new section. This is called, what we were doing before was lower textual criticism. This is higher criticism. And I can summarize higher criticism just by saying we are so much smarter than the ancient people were. What C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. I mean, it's not true. We're not smarter than the ancients were. In fact, they weren't distracted by a lot of things that we have. I mean, there's this great book called The City of God written by St. Augustine. Augustine, whatever your preference is. And I told Pastor earlier today, I wish I had it in hardback because it weighs in at like 750 pages. And he was around the time of 430 AD, writing from a Christian standpoint. He was converted to Christianity, and he was writing in defense of Christianity and railing against idol worship in Greece and Rome at that time period. And if you don't think these people were smart, read something like that, because the sentences are a page long, and you have to read them multiple times because they're so deep with so many thoughts packed into them.
As I was telling you earlier, in one of the papers that I wrote in seminary was I had to read Tertullian, Origen, and the depth of their language and the depth of their understanding. It just rolls off the page as you read them. They were not unintelligent people. They were not peasants by any means.
right.
Not as we imagine them to
Do it?
be. Not as we imagine peasants to have been. But they all had brains.
Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of those early writers were quite ornate in their language and in their arguments.
Yeah. It's impressive. If you get a chance to read some of the really old writing, it is very interesting to read.
So, higher criticism is something that's largely been abandoned in every other field. There exists another methodology for determining the authenticity of text, namely higher textual criticism. Liberal Bible scholars are the only ones still using this methodology, as it is highly unreliable and has been rejected in other disciplines. So if you hear disputes about who actually wrote the book of the Bible, or that it was written by multiple authors, you should be suspicious that higher criticism was used to reach that speculative conclusion. So what is higher criticism? It analyzes the writing style in a book. It tries to determine, based on shifts in that style, whether or not the book was written by multiple people, whether it was people copying from other sources, or whether it was actually written by the author that it was purported to be written by. So the higher critics compare the consistency of style within a document and also against other documents supposedly authored by the same writer. For example, the Gospel of John uses a completely different writing style than Revelation. Therefore, the higher critic would conclude that the Revelation was not written by John, and 90% of modern liberal Bible scholars would share this conviction. However, doesn't it make sense that the book of John, the Gospel of John, would be written in a different format, different form than Revelation? Yes.
Another very simple way of understanding that, if you go back and, for instance, a paper you would have written when you were in engineering, studying engineering, and compare that with a paper that you're going to write next week, how would you compare those two? They're going to be different. And one of the arguments is that there's two authors for the prophet Isaiah. Well, there's probably a 30-year span between those two sections of Isaiah, and so things would have changed.
Dr. Montgomery used the example, compare your term papers to your love letters.
Yeah.
More modern, compare your letters to your texts. Are you going to write the same way? So,
let's talk about, we'll compare the two, John and Revelation. Okay, from the Gospel of John, chapter 20. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So it was John's point in writing the Gospel of John. He was writing it for a specific purpose, recounting events. He kept using language like what we have seen, what we have touched. He was recording all these events, and especially the miracles. The miracles underwrote the deity of Christ, right? Now compare that to Revelation. So Revelation was written hastily to record a vision that was given to John while in prison on the Isle of Patmos. He wasn't giving a historical narrative of the events he participated in, completely different than the Gospel of John, right? So naturally, these two books are going to use a different style. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, "Write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches." I'll skip from 1 to 22, chapter 22. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things, and when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, "You must not do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and your brothers, the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God." And he said to me, "Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near." So John, in writing the Revelation, or the revelation of Jesus Christ, was zapped by the Holy Spirit, given a vision that was fairly mind-blowing, and told to write it down and don't omit anything, and to send it to the churches. And he wrote as fast as he could and tried to record all of that information. So again, recording historical eyewitness accounts, the style and form of how you write, it's going to be different than trying to very quickly write down a vision that you were given. Does it make sense? The entire higher criticism methodology is bad scholarship. New Testament scholars named McGregor and Morton did a computer analysis of St. Paul's letters. They fed Romans and Galatians into a computer, establishing a stylistic standard of comparison. Then they fed the other supposed Pauline letters into a computer to see if the styles compared adequately. The conclusion was that 6 or 7 people had written these letters. That was from Dr. Montgomery in The Sensible Christianity. So subsequently, some people at Harvard took McGregor and Morton's book on the subject and fed the style and preface of the first chapter into a computer and checked the other chapters against it and found that 5 people had written their book. Right? Kind of shut that down. And C.S. Lewis commented on this, saying that the higher critics who were trying to determine the underlying sources for his various works never got it right once. And he was alive while it was happening. So if this methodology doesn't work when applied to a contemporary figure, how could it possibly work for analyzing ancient writings? So they never got it right. He said, you would think occasionally they would get it right when they were trying to guess at what the underlying sources for his works were, and he was alive at the time. One would think you could just call him. So, you got to just recognize when you're hearing things that are arguing that a certain book of the Bible is written by 5 people, you should kind of sense where that's coming from. And it's coming from something that's just pure subjectivist. The whole method is just bad scholarship because it doesn't fundamentally make any sense. And you can see that in your different writing styles. And if you write something that sounds pretty cool, people are the higher critic is like, well, that couldn't have come from him. He must be ripping off of somebody else, and goes off trying to find who he got that information from. So the higher critical method is not something that, again, deserves really any of our attention. But again, if you start thinking, well, how do we know who wrote the book of Mark? Doesn't it make sense to go back to who John said wrote the book of Mark and told his students, who told their students, who told their students, as opposed to looking at what's proven to be bad scholarship methodologically, and to point to that as being, well, obviously that couldn't have been written by this person, or Paul couldn't have written all of his letters, or it's just something that is not really considered credible in the academic field for any other discipline. There was one professor that Dr. Montgomery talks about that said they worked for a long time trying to determine the real author of Homer's Iliad. And after working on it for a long period of time, they finally came to the conclusion that if it wasn't written by Homer, it was written around the same time by somebody with the same name.
When the scholars met in their convention, or whatever that was called, to determine what books were going to go into the New Testament, they chucked a bunch of them aside. And how did they, on what basis, were they using higher criticism to determine which books would formulate the New Testament?
That's a good question that we probably should spend some time on.
It really has to do with them being underwritten by the apostles or people that were contemporaries of when the books were being written, certified their authenticity and their validity to be put into the canon. So the development of the canon is something that's, I will add that to my list that we should probably talk about, because there's some thoughts, well, how does this book get put in and how does this book get put in? And there are books that are homina legumina and antilegomena. I just like saying those words. In other words, books that everybody agreed should be in, and books that had words against them, the antilegomena.
I saw that on a menu in a Thai restaurant.
Yeah, don't eat anything called homina legumina in a menu in a Thai restaurant. But yeah, there were some books like Revelation and James that there was a debate whether they should be in the Bible, and eventually everybody agreed that they should. Hebrews, because of the authorship, So there were some books that were antilegomena. I think the only general guideline we'd use is you let things in an antilegomena book overrule something in a homina legumina book. Anyway, yeah, good topic. I will see if we can insert that into a future class just so I can say those words again.
Anything else? I think we're going to wrap it up because we're at 10:20. And the next thing we're going to talk about is some archaeological evidence, and actually put some pictures on the screen for next week. Nothing? Yes, right.
Well, I just find the fact that there was 24,000 original original scripts, and this all had to be hand done.
Yeah, pre-printing press, right?
Right, it's pre-printing press, and to have that many copies of these texts, that many copies. John's not going to sit down and write, 1,000 copies.
Right. The whole job of scribe was very formal. You write down exactly what you have received, and you can't make mistakes, otherwise it's something you have to burn it. So, yeah, the transcription was very faithful, which you can see in the fact that there aren't that many. There's a lot of little copyist errors, like the thing we've talked about, he said versus Jesus said. that there aren't fundamental errors that would call into question anything that's in these texts. There just are not things that would.
In the writings of other ancient people like Plato, Plato had plenty of students as well. But yeah, that makes me, that's what I sit there and thought. I was like, why weren't they scribing the stuff that he was, that he had written? And it was because it comes back to, the substance of the text.
Right.
The meaning of the text. Like you said, you don't get 12 men to sit together and conspire to do something and believe in it so much so that they would die independently of each other. Because they weren't all martyred together as a group.
Right.
It's kind of like when you get a cop and a detective together and there's a group of people who've committed a crime, they'll have them together and then they break them apart and try to break up their stories. And in all 12 of these, their stories never deviated.
Right. They say slightly different things from different perspectives, but they don't have contradictions. And we'll talk about this when we get to the errors and contradictions in the text. A lot of things that are called contradictions are not contradictions. A contradiction requires two things to be said that logically that are not possible to both be true. And so Jesus said versus he said is not a contradiction. It is just a copyist variance or the spelling of a word. Anything that would count as a error in the manuscripts.
Yeah.
Yes.
One of the things you need to pile on top of those $25,000 copies of the text is add to that all of the early church fathers from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries that quoted scriptures in their documents that also validate what's in those the New Testament.
And isn't it cool now? I mean, I got the book written by Irenaeus. It's
Yeah.
translated for us, and you can get it, from Amazon online on your Kindle. I mean, it's wonderful that we're able to access some of this stuff without having to go to the local library or something.
Right.
All right.
Let's close in prayer. Thank you, Lord, that we've been able to be gathered here in your house to continue to learn and grow in our knowledge of the historicity of your Bible so that we can continue to make a better witness for the gospel. Amen.